Hi there, it's Jorge again. In our 6th podcast episode, we have Catherine de Vries, who visited us recently at University College Dublin. Catherine is a Westjic Chair and Professor of Political Behavior at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. She is a leading expert in Euroscepticism, and her book, Euroscepticism and the Future of European Integration, received the European Union Studies Association Best Book in EU Studies Award in 2019. It was also listed in the top 5 books on Europe's future by the Financial Times. Catherine has visited us as the second guest in our seminar speaker series. You can find more information about this series on our webpage, or follow us on Twitter for regular updates.
Thank you very much for coming to UCD. Really enjoyed your presentation today. I've read your book on Euroscepticism and European integration. So we might just start off, Catherine, by what is Euroscepticism?
So I guess people would generally think that Euroscepticism just means being negative about the EU or not liking the European Union very much. So that's maybe true, but I suggest that it's only half of the story. So the way that I think about Euroscepticism is that's a relationship. So a relationship between what you think about the EU, but also very much about what you think about your own nation state or your own conditions, national conditions. So you can get a situation in which people are not actually, if you ask them, do you want to stay a member of the EU, yes or no, they might still say in minority, or 40% say, we want to stay. So that would look Eurosceptic, right? But then if you would compare it with something that they have at home, they might be even more negative about politics at home. I mean, we know that people are not particularly positive about politics at the moment. So the way that I conceive of it is a relationship between how you view your nation state and how you view the European Union.
So typically a Eurosceptic position would be critical of more European integration, right?
Well, yes and no. So the way that I kind of conceive of it is that you have 2 dimensions that people consider. So they might consider membership or just being part of the European Union. And they consider what I call more the kind of outcomes. So they look at the regime and they look at the outcomes. So the way they might be evaluating the regime is, do I want to be a member of this, yes or no? But also, do I think that, the EU is democratic, the institutions are working well? And the other part is, what are actually the outcomes that the EU produces? So you can think of the euro, you could think maybe of bailout packages in the Eurozone crisis. You can also think about just kind of environmental standards. So in that way, it's not so easy to say that a person who is skeptical about policy or skeptical about certain things in the EU, think, for example, about how Ireland was treated in the Eurozone crisis, that person is necessarily Eurosceptic. They might still think that Ireland is better off within the EU, but they're skeptical of certain policies that the EU pursues. So those people I actually call ambivalent rather than than kind of arch Eurosceptics, if you will.
Yeah. So is Euroscepticism, I mean, we're talking about public opinion here, right?
Yes.
And we'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of the typology that you use in the book. But I suppose typically when people think about Euroscepticism, they usually have a political party in mind, or a political leader, or a certain image of a Euro. They think UKIP or something like this. So is Euroscepticism in public opinion rising, and are these parties simply capturing that rise in Eurosceptic attitudes?
Mm-hmm. So it depends on which time frame you're looking at. So if you look at the time frame since, let's say, the start of the European Union, so for certain countries that it was in the 1950s, for other countries in the 1970s, for Sweden or so, it was only in 1995 that they accessed, or East European countries only in 2004, that people probably, in terms of how we look at public opinion, have become more skeptical. But I would want to do a little caveat in that we don't really know if people really had opinions about the EU very early on. Since, let's say, the introduction of the euro, eastward enlargement, people are much more informed about the EU. If we just kind of take maybe as the early 2000s as a cutoff point, and now, you actually see that there's been a development towards Euroscepticism. It was at the height basically in 2008, between 2008 and 2012, so that's in the midst of the Eurozone crisis. Many people were wondering, the euro was some protection mechanism against, economic turmoil, and it's actually not really, showing to be that. Then you saw another spike in 2015, the refugee crisis. But actually what you've seen since post-Brexit, that actually some people are suggesting, oh, so that's the alternative? Taking back control, as a Brexiteer would say, well, that doesn't look so good. That looks very problematic. So actually you see a little bit of a softening, or actually really a little bit of a decrease of Euroscepticism. So I guess it really also reflects, in some ways, what's happening in the real world and the conditions. So there's been a rise, but there's been a little bit, at least of a halt, or even maybe of a decrease in Euroscepticism again recently.
Okay. So can we distinguish between a Euro-critical perspective and a Eurosceptic perspective?
Yes.
And is it the case that at least people would assume that on the left often it's a Euro-critical perspective, where the Eurosceptic perspective is often driven by a kind of sovereignist argument about, as you say, take back control, leave this entire project and reinstitute policies at the national level?
Yeah, so actually I didn't refer to that before you were saying like which political parties or which actors. So I kind of developed a typology which has 4 types. So exit skeptics, well, there we can think of, par excellence, probably Nigel Farage, right? So Brexit party, previous UK independence party. Then I have policy skeptics. So those people who actually like the idea of Europe, like the kind of idea of working together, but are very, very skeptical of the policies. So some people maybe remember the finance minister in Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, right? He was kind of that kind of argument. So he likes the idea of Europe. He thinks that there is actually a lot of benefits in cooperating, especially on the Green New Deal that he's now proposing, but not in terms of the policies. He thinks that the EU is pursuing much more kind of a banking union, for big banks, big corporations. So that would be the kind of maybe critical left position that you referred to. But then you also have what's called regime skeptics. So those are actually, if you earlier on say, some green politicians. So you saw that maybe for most people this is too long ago, but someone like Joschka Fischer, who used to be the foreign minister, and who was very supportive of having climate change policy at the European level, but he felt that the EU was not democratic enough, that it was not doing enough for democratic legitimacy. Also, some German philosophers like Habermas actually is known to have that type of position. And then you have loyal supporters. So those are actually, the fans of Europe, very, very supportive. You can think of many liberal parties. You can think ultimately now of a politician, Macron, right, who was very, the French president, very, very attuned with that idea of further integration. The question you asked about left and right, and very much on political parties. So you can definitely say that at the political party side. So I think at the political party side, you see more left being skeptical when it has to do with big banks. Think about Mélenchon in France. Think about the Left Party in Germany, the Socialist Party in the Netherlands, also Sinn Féin in Ireland, for example. And then with the idea of sovereignty and taking back control would be, and especially taking back control of our borders, right? That's a very strong, more on the right. But I don't think that one is more Eurosceptic necessarily than the other. So you do see actually also it's on both sides. There's not, since Brexit, not much of an exit idea anymore. But you saw that also traditionally on the left, that they were actually quite strong advocating ideas of at least renationalization. And the interesting element is what you actually saw is that they felt that, for example, free movement of people would actually bring down wages. So they actually wanted to quote unquote take back control, and that had to do very much with the welfare state, protecting the welfare state, protecting worker rights. So we often see it in the media, this idea that on the right is more, but I think historically that's not entirely correct.
Interesting. So there's obviously a lot of cross-national variation between these different views on European integration, different dimensions of Euroscepticism. So you have the exit, the hard anti-EU, the loyal, everything is wonderful, and then most people somewhere in the middle, either critical or not of policies or of the regime or the procedures. So is it possible to generate a theory that would explain that variation? Why is it that there is such differences in these attitudes towards European integration effectively?
So I think the way the way that I said is coming back to what Euroscepticism is, this relationship to what you're how you view your nation state versus how you view the EU. I'll just give you an example. So if you were born and raised in Spain, for example, that's had huge state capacity and corruption problems recently, then some people actually think that the EU, which even has had its corruption scandals and you know, about MEPs, members of the European Parliament, not registering their flights correctly and so on. Well, that looks kind of like peanuts in comparison to what you have at home, right? The same maybe for the Greeks. So for Dutch people or for Swedes, where a minister has to resign when they, you know, misplace a taxi receipt of €5, seeing that kind of corruption scandal at the European level really is something where people, you know, has really put a dent into the idea that the EU is for good governance, for example, in the Netherlands. So I think one thing is that it really has to do with real conditions, so the degree to which you're used to having, you know, quality of government issues versus not. Also the degree to which you think that the European Union is associated with growth, or is it associated with net paying, etc. So I think it's very much this idea about is, you know, what I kind of say in the book, because there's not a kind of general identification with Europe, and we know that that's actually also not increasing. So there's not many people who feel European. When people, you know, the best the EU can get is basically people feeling Irish and European. But that makes people quite transactional when it comes to the EU. So like, what have you done for me lately? And the kind of benchmarks they use in order to see is the EU doing well or not are very often national benchmarks. So that's what they're used to in their national level. That's what they know the most. So is the EU then doing better or worse in comparison?
So in the book, you also talk about perceptions of the status quo or the alternative. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the main drivers of Euroscepticism is the perception that actually things could be better outside of the EU.
Yes.
And the perception that things could be better outside of the EU tends to exist in countries that are relatively high income, doing relatively well. And there's a perception of, well, actually things are wonderful in the Netherlands or in Germany or in Denmark or in Sweden or in certain parts of the UK. And the EU is somehow problematic, where the reverse happens in typically the lower income countries, whereby the projection is onto the national. So is that what's happening here, that the perception that things could be better outside, that's driving Euroscepticism?
Yes, and what I really also show in the book is that's because people are attributing so that for example, the Netherlands, just let me take the Netherlands. So the Netherlands actually, people tend to forget that, but in the 1980s it was the sick man of Europe. Huge unemployment, huge problem, had to do wage restraint, etc. And ultimately, I mean, if you like it or not, it liberalized its workforce, etc., and it became a richer country. If it's more equal, it's another question, but you know, it became richer. And that actually, we know, that's been calculated by Bruegel, for example, or by Bertelsmann, so think tanks, that had to do really with the single market. That the area between Amsterdam and Rotterdam, not entirely surprising, Rotterdam, one of the biggest ports in Europe, have really flourished on the European integration. But the interesting thing is that if you were doing an experiment with Dutch people, they attribute that to Dutch institutions and Dutch politicians rather than to the single market, because it's very intangible what the effect of the single market was. So the way I see it, it's like European integration has provided this tree, so it's at least a stability and it's growing. For certain regions at least, there's been clear fruits, and actually those have been regions that you just described that are doing relatively well. Small, open economies, high levels of skills, so people who are very highly educated could really benefit from that market, and people want to live there because, you know, there's a lot of English spoken, etc. So they also got a lot of advantages through free movement of people, and they're taking these apples from the tree, and then they think, well, maybe we don't need. Oh, we have a lot of apples. Maybe we don't really need a tree. And actually, what you also see is that actually they don't even want to water the tree, so that other parts of the European Union, think, you know, more peripheral countries that are doing, on average, still worse, could benefit from that. And that's this idea, because people are not really understanding what that tree is. So, you know, besides the fact that there can be serious issues with the tree, there can be criticisms about what the single market has done and structural imbalances, and has the EU exacerbated problems between peripheral countries and core countries. But what is so interesting that in the core, which has clearly benefited, so those are the countries that you just described, so Northern European rich countries, people are primarily attributing the benefits of European integration to their own national systems.
And the opposite is happening in other parts, where
Yes.
in Spain or
Yes.
well, Italy, of course, is somewhere in between, but in
Yes.
Greece, classically, country that has, I think by all measures, not done particularly well from the European Union over the past 10 years. On the contrary, pretty regressive economic policies imposed on them that have clearly not worked, yet public opinion in Greece does not seem to be Eurosceptic in the way it might be in certain parts of Germany.
No, and ultimately they didn't really want to leave. So there was this idea that, oh, maybe, and then they realized what the consequence would that be outside the euro, and then it was like, no, we don't want to do that, right? And I think I'm always reminded by something that Zapatero, was a previous Spanish prime minister, said. And when they were full on in the Eurozone and etc., they said, we're in the Champions League of Europe. So the idea that these are peripheral countries, people are aware of that, but there are other countries that are richer. And then being part of the club already gets a huge premium. Where a Dutch person, maybe, on average a bit entitled because it's already part of that club. Of course we're part of the club, right? So there's no actual premium on that type of membership. And then they start thinking, actually, do I want to be part of this club when I have to start paying for Greece? I mean, technically, of course, we're not paying for Greece. We were paying primarily for banks who were lending to Greece. But the idea that, we will be supporting poorer regions is not a very popular message among the Dutch electorate or the German electorate.
So we can measure public opinion, and your research has broken new ground on this, because in European integration studies there wasn't much focus on European public opinion. Public opinion didn't really matter. Elites made decisions, and ultimately it was those state elite bargains that shaped the trajectory of European integration. So you're showing that public opinion does matter, and it's impossible or increasingly difficult for political parties at the national and the European level to ignore public opinion. So the deeper question there is, where does public opinion come from, right? And I know you're interested in questions of narratives and legitimizing discourses. So if in the Netherlands there is a narrative that we're paying for those lazy Greeks, which empirically is not true, you're basically providing resources, public resources to French banks, where do those narratives come from?
So one big source of those narratives are political parties. So when you see that, I think why Eurosceptic narratives have been so dominant in the last years. So those can be narratives about big banks. So those can be narratives that are on the left. Those can be narratives about, cosmopolitan Brussels elites selling us out to migrants or things like that, right? So it can be on the both on the left and the right. It's because it's very difficult for governments that have to strike bargains in Brussels that are never ideal because they're a bargain. They often are not defending them at home, and they're often saying, well, I was forced to do this, right? So then you get, I know this is really in the Irish interest, but I was forced by the other member states to do X, Y, and Z. So that gives a lot of possibility for Eurosceptics to add on to that, to even push it further. And what we really have is a situation, because there's so many languages, because there's no real European public sphere, that national governments are the ones that need to carry the European message within their domestic electorates or in their domestic public opinion. Also, they need to get domestically elected. So they're talking much more about what it means to be Irish, what it means to be Dutch, and then, et cetera, and why is it good to be there. They don't want to say, well, actually, what the EU is doing is really great, and it's not because I'm great, it's because the EU is great. So they're, the way they're talking about Europe is very ambivalent. And then then you just have extremist parties that are usually on the extreme right and on the extreme left that are smelling blood, and they think, well, this is a pro-EU kind of or kind of ambivalent elite that's not really. I mean, Macron is basically the exception, who's been very pro-EU, but overall, most governments are not. Think Merkel, think Mark Rutte in the Netherlands, so Merkel, the German chancellor, and they then think, well, the EU is great because I'm actually Eurosceptic, so I can get this message through. The government is ambivalent, so they're not really going to defend the EU, but also many mainstream parties are internally split on the EU. So in terms of party strategy, developing a narrative that is anti-EU is extremely beneficial because you can create, think UKIP, the perfect example is UKIP and the Conservative Party in Britain, right? So the Conservative Party extremely divided in European integration, and the UK Independence Party driving a wedge in that party, which ultimately they were effectively granted a referendum, and then that led to this, and then basically the UKIP party position became now the Conservative position. And I think that a lot of it comes from party strategy. But interestingly, I do not know, and that would be interesting next research. Is that really ideological? So is Geert Wilders really? Is his goal really to go out of the EU and to be here. I wonder if that's true. I think also a lot of these times, these narratives are strategic in order to create a difference between Geert Wilders and Prime Minister Mark Rutte. And then on top of that, he's just being Eurosceptic. So it's an add-on, if you will, to things like immigration, to things like on the right, and to things like being for social justice and so on the left. But it doesn't matter for public opinion, right? They're getting these narratives, and then that's the way the EU is framed. But I think one fundamental issue is that the pro-European side, so Brussels itself, is hardly heard in domestic narratives. It's often ambivalent government parties that don't really say that they're for or against, and then oftentimes in national systems, these kind of Eurosceptic narratives get more attention.
So you get a political entrepreneur,
yes,
a challenger party,
yes,
that identifies a gap
yes,
in the market,
yes,
and that gap is, well, everybody's having a nice cozy consensus here about European Union and European wonderful. I can really try to mobilize and develop a narrative here that actually the EU is part of your
yes,
source of your problems,
yes,
even though, in objectively speaking, it's not. Is that the kind of driving force that
yes,
we see? Because I know you've done work on challenger parties.
So the next book that I'm actually, that's forthcoming next year at Princeton University Press, called Political Entrepreneurs, that I co-authored with Sarah Holbert from the London School of Economics. And there we kind of make the argument that so you have many parties that try to be successful, but challenger parties that are successful do two things. They do what we call issue entrepreneurship. So they mobilize a wedge issue, so an issue that splits other parties, the consensus, so that doesn't fit usually very easily on a left-right economic dimension, because that's where traditional politics has been mostly about, but that cuts across it, and that then makes it difficult for government parties to react, right? Because they themselves are Labour, internally divided on the EU, the Conservative Party, internally divided on the EU, Dutch Liberal Party, go on and go on and go on. But the second thing they do is they also need to make sure that if the government party could, coalesce on a more Eurosceptic position, if that's what they're mobilizing, that they cannot become the true owners of this Eurosceptic issue. So what they usually do is a combination of issue entrepreneurship and anti-establishment sentiment. So really saying, these other guys, they're trying to sell you out to Brussels. This is, they're not competent. They're not the managers that you think they are. And why do challenger parties do that? They're not in government. So they need to, in order for them to seem trustworthy, they have to destroy the trust that people have to these other parties. And there's where the EU comes in, because the EU is this fundamentally establishment project, right? So very far away removed from Irish politics, maybe not at the moment on Brexit, but traditionally, right, on domestic politics. So then it's almost this perfect condition. It's a wedge issue, and secondly, it seems like this technocratic elite that's a little bit out of touch with domestic politics. And I think that's why it's become a really, really kind of target of choice, if you will, for these entrepreneurs.
So would it be fair to say that rising Eurosceptic public opinion, or marginal rise, is driven by party competition then?
So I think that it's very difficult to do. So if we think about what is driven by public opinion and what is driven by political parties, those two things are very related to each other. So that's very difficult to know. But when it comes to so for example, other entrepreneurs do not need to be only on the extreme left or the extreme right, or they could also be like green entrepreneurs, right, that are trying now to mobilize climate change. So there we see that they have tried this before, but they're not so successful. And now they're very successful because it's become really, with Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg and so on, it's gotten more traction, and then these parties also become more positive. So I don't think it's always only a challenge party driven. And I think the reason for that is that you also see, you had a lot of these parties pushing on anti-EU kind of platforms very early on, but they did so much better in the financial crisis, and that was because it became a Euro debt crisis. They did so much better when it was the refugee crisis, because there was a European component. So I think, when can these parties do really well? When the way they frame the issue somewhat has a bearing to what people are reading about in the news, in some ways seem to be in line with what quote-unquote objective conditions, if we can call those things objective, right? So I think it also needs to resonate. I think it's not enough. I mean, the majority of parties that try to drive a wedge and that try to do something new are unsuccessful, right? So, but you need to have this combination of that you're an issue entrepreneur that is anti-establishment, but also that there needs to be a situation in where there's some susceptibility on the side of voters. And that often is when there's some form of big scandal, can be a big corruption scandal, can be a big economic crisis, so something that's a bit off tilt, or reality is a bit off tilt. And I think then it resonates even more.
So, and the question of corruption governability relates back to the core theory in your book about, if things are, our country is governed well, it's doing particularly well, we have no real major structural complaints about our society or our government, and then all of a sudden fiscal resources have to be committed to another country, it kind of creates the conditions for this Eurosceptic challenger parties to mobilize what is a latent Eurosceptic public opinion.
Yes.
So why should we care about all of this?
So so when I give talks in Brussels, this is what I often get, because I guess a lot of people in the Brussels bubble are like, well, but we're doing all this good for people and people should just see it and all of this is just fine. So we should care about it, I guess, from a Brussels perspective, is if Le Pen wins an election, that's going to seriously constrain what the EU could do. Euroscepticism is a major driving force for Brexit. I mean, Brexit also had to do with domestic, as I would be the first to say, with domestic British reasons. Whatever you think about Brexit, but Brexit is also a lose-lose situation for the European Union. I remember with Pablo Iglesias, so one of those challenger parties in Spain, the leader of Podemos, a left challenger party, said, if the club was so good, then people wouldn't want to leave it, right? So it still gives you also a sense of that there are issues at the European level and that people are increasingly wary of that. However, it matters only to the extent when it is linked to party support, so to Eurosceptic parties that are favoring some form of renationalization, and when it's linked to some form of wanting to have a referendum. And I think there Brexit comes in, which is interesting. So what I outline in the book is that what is the most kind of, for the EU, most problematic sense of Euroscepticism is what I call exit skepticism. So people who perceive that the EU is not beneficial either for the regime nor for the policy, and they want to do the risk, right? Alternatively, maybe going to do something else, leaving the European Union, like the Brexiteers. So that is not looking that good. And as I show in the book, that people are actually seeing that, well, maybe leaving is not so optimal. And Brexit gives them that glimpse. What you now get is what I have called in a recent blog, remain skepticism. So you get those people that want to remain in the European Union, but they want to amorph the European Union to something that they can work with. Think about Salvini in Italy. Think about Le Pen, Wilders, etc. They no longer have references to exit, but they've taken them out of the manifestos because those are not popular anymore. But they want to renationalize the European Union. So one can say, if one is in favor of that, then that's great. But if you think about climate change and big problems and inequality and poverty within the European Union, it's very unlikely that a state in and of itself outside the European Union could address those issues that basically cross borders in an effective way alone. So in that way, I think all of us should be very worried about Euroscepticism in whatever form it is. But I think that the only thing that I think is very unfortunate, that oftentimes is within or from EU circles, you often hear, but it's just because people are not informed enough. It's a PR problem, right? So if we only had a public relations, that would be fine. But I think what it does show is that people have serious concerns. They have serious concerns if a policy, that works for one EU country also works for another. And there are many experts, economists or political scientists who worry about the same thing. So I do think that in order to deal, we should care about Euroscepticism, but we should also take it seriously. So being skeptical belongs to every regime, right? Every political system will have people who are unhappy. But then we need to also make sure that we're listening to that unhappiness. Where does it come from? What can we do in order to change it? And what are then the key aspects on which we should be focusing? So hence, there's a new European Commission coming in. I would definitely plead to them to try to really carve out some core aspects where they would think that acting together in concert brings benefits, but also maybe some other areas where we should see more flexibility. Think about budget rules, for example. Where climate change would be very much where we should work together, and there shouldn't be any problem of free riding. So I think the EU needs to think about that aspect. And I think you see that in public opinion.
And in the conclusion of your book, you talk about, the European Union needs to put a little bit more emphasis on its united in diversity rather than the kind of move towards convergence or promoting a one-size-fits-all, or in many cases when it comes to budgetary policy or fiscal policies, one-size-fits-none. But it seems to me that message has been lost during the Brexit debate, because Brexit seems to have spurred at least public elites or elite discourses you can't critique the European Union, you can't criticize some of the major economic policy decisions that they've taken, which have turned out to be quite disastrous. So is there something to be said there that, they've blocked off that debate, but it's ultimately simmering, it's simmering underneath the surface?
So in that way, kind of Brexit is a catch-22 for the EU. And I've argued it's lose-lose. In the sense that it first gives you a sense that, also Brexit for public opinion, if you think about an alternative state, the UK, if it leaves or not, we'll see how it goes, but it will be an emeritus member state on your shores forever, with which people are benchmarking how well the EU is doing. So that's a big risk. If the UK will look better, now that we can also, I'm a social scientist, I'm not only going to work on what's happened today, but I have to look in the future. You can think a situation in which the UK, maybe it will not be an equal growth, but will create enormous growth by, for example, becoming a kind of deregulated Singapore on the Thames. And then the pound is going to do extremely well, and then the Eurozone is going to look weak or sluggish. And then you're going to see ideas of Northern European member states. We want, maybe we're going to flirt again. So Brexit is not over. But at this moment in time, you see that indeed Brexit has given people the idea that the alternative to EU membership is worse. But the fundamental thing that I want many people to understand is that not wanting to leave the European Union doesn't mean that you like the European Union. So the idea is that you can have ambivalence. People can want to be part of the regime, but dislike the policies at the same time. That is not irrational, that is very rational. So you say, okay, being part of this club is okay, and I think it's better than not being part of the club. And being in Ireland, one could probably say that, having peace on the Irish island is more important than many other things. However, that doesn't mean that because I say I want to be part of the club, I should be actually totally allowed to say what's wrong with the club, right? The same as that you could say to your brother, well, I don't like what you're doing. For part of the family, you should be able to say that. Maybe I'm Dutch, we are very, very open about, very direct, as some foreigners have always told me. But anyway, I think that actually it is really a mature, it would show the maturity of the project that we can say, yes, I'm pro-EU. I like being part of this club. However, I dislike the execution. And this is what I want to see. And if those two things cannot be same time, what kind of Democrats are we, right? You should be able to critique something in a proper manner. And that's what worries me a little bit with then now public opinion, which I also show in the book, that post-Brexit is really increased support for membership. But we don't see so much traction on the policy aspect, actually. People are not necessarily more positive about the policies coming out of the European Union. So I think the European Union needs to show what it's made of. Okay, you've raised expectations. You say you want to be, you want to be this, you want to be all this possibility for member states to be more than the sum of their parts, right? Really to mean more. Well, show it. And I think that's totally reasonable. But there you see national interest playing in, like a lot of the things that you say. And I think this idea of not critiquing is hurting the European Union more than it's actually helping it.
So what is the future of European integration?
Well, it's a tricky question. So at least in the short term, I would say because of Brexit, there will be quite a lot of support for membership. In the long term, all bets are off for me. So I think that what has shown, Brexit shows that it's possible to leave. This is crucially important. And many EU elites just kind of wave over that as if that's not important. It's crucially important that you can leave. And that a member state would, we don't know, right? But it would have really left. Then secondly, if it is true that growth is not necessary, that growth can actually be what makes people sometimes also turn against the EU, you could see a situation in which if indeed the UK will look better, or we have another big crisis, that again, richer member states think, maybe we can go it alone. It's more difficult for smaller countries, right? The UK is bigger than, let's say, the Netherlands. But then you can have an issue of what we sometimes call adverse selection, right? So you get a European Union where only those who stay, who think that being outside of it is worse. But then you get basically a club of, not losers, but laggards, if you will, right? And that is a possibility. It will depend on a lot of things, but I think there is an inflection point, and the EU needs to really show its added value. And the fact that it thinks that sometimes it doesn't need to show that, I just don't understand that. It is a constructed political project. I'm very happy it's there. I was in the Netherlands. We've been really the victim of 2 wars. My father went through the war, all of that. But that in itself is not enough. We need to have a European Union that works for every member state and for at least as many people as possible. If it's only something that works for the core, if it's only something that works for banks, if it's only something that works for the strongest in society, then I think we're not doing what we should be doing. We're not living up to the Jean Monnets and the big founding fathers of European integration that wanted to build a community among men or among women, among people, not just a set of institutions. And I think if it becomes that, I think no one, coming back to Iglesias' comment, it will be a club that everyone wants to be a part of, rather than that people would like to leave.
We might just finish on this last point then, which is, I know you're flying off to Milan this afternoon. So Italy, for me, is an interesting country to observe here. And it seems to me that a large amount of the debates on the future of European integration will be played out in Italy.
Yes.
Because Italy structurally is not benefiting from the single currency in particular. And the commitment to following a one-size-fits-all fiscal policy in particular is not working for the Italian growth model. And I just wonder, when will that begin to break out of public opinion, and whether or not Italy can really sustain its membership unless more flexibility is given to Italy to adapt and respond to domestic political and economic concerns and constraints.
So first on the latter point. So you're hearing now the incoming Commission President von der Leyen has said that she will allow more flexibility. So we'll see what will happen. Lagarde is also known to be as political as she is. Well, actually, she's technically not an economist, so not necessarily a banker. So we might see some more political wiggle room for Italy. But I think the Italian case is really interesting in the sense that I always do the analogy with my daughter. My daughter's 4. So if she plays a game and she always loses, she doesn't want to play the game anymore. And I think that is something which is in Italy. Italy has been, in some ways, hammered out twice. So first, that it has structural problems coming coming also from state capacity problems in Italy, right? But also coming from the Eurozone, as you outlined, and you're much more an expert on that than I am. And secondly, also from the influx of refugees. So if you think about this as being a Rawlsian, right? So economic liberty. So imagine a veil of ignorance. You don't know where you stand in society, and then Rawls's argument is that you want some form of redistribution because you don't know if you're going to be at the top or the bottom. So imagine there's a veil of ignorance in the European Union. You don't know if you're going to be Italy, you don't know how you're going to be in the Netherlands. What would you like to see? Well, not what it is now. And I think that the idea of the lasting legacy of the Eurozone in the South, and that's not just Greece, but it's even Spain, which is very pro-EU. But it's also Poland. It's also the fact that some are more equal than others, right? So that this is a club at the core, that ultimately the core closes ranks, and that then it's a discussion of like, well, you're not productive enough, you're not doing enough, and that's your problem. So imagine, in the time that we had the very devastating terrorist attack in France, Je suis Charlie, that was in Charlie Hebdo. Imagine that Angela Merkel would have said, Je suis grec, we're all Greek, and we're going to deal with this problem together. That was not what happened. In the Eurozone crisis, it was nation first. So then we can say we don't like Donald Trump. We can say we don't like Boris Johnson when they're saying these things. But actually, the image that we're seeing from the Eurozone crisis was this, right? So I understand that for Northern European elected officials, it's very difficult to get redistribution through election campaigns. But maybe one thing we could explain is how much these two exporting, and the Netherlands and Germany I specifically talk about, maybe also even Finland, where we see also some of this boiling up, but how much two exporting nations have had a benefit of a Eurozone. And they've gotten also the top educated Italians on top of it that want to live in Amsterdam, want to live in Berlin, right? So there is a story to tell about inequality in the Eurozone. That's an economic story, but that's a political story as well. And I think it is really crucial to create, as I already said before, to create a union that doesn't work for some member states, but that works for all member states. And there you need to think about, most federal systems that fund some form of redistributive mechanism. Finanzausgleich, you call it in German, right? So I do think we need to think about that. I fully understand it's difficult to get through elections, but I cannot see another way.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been a really interesting conversation, and thank you for coming to UCD.
Thank you for having me.